Okay, so for number 26, we are going to try and determine which of these following expressions is equal to the cosine of 125. I'm just going to write yes or no for each. Alright, so let's start with looking at what the value of cosine of 125 should be, and it should be a negative answer. So I need to look through here and I need to try and decide which of these might be positive answers. Well, cosine of 145 is negative, so that one might be a possibility. Sine of 235 is in the third quadrant, and so that could possibly be negative. Sine of 145, that is in the second quadrant. Sine in the second quadrant is positive. So I know for sure that B could not be possible. Cosine of 295 is in the fourth quadrant. Cosine in the fourth quadrant is positive. So therefore, I know that this is definitely not going to be the same. And then in I, cosine of 325, if I go around, again, that's in the fourth quadrant. Fourth quadrant is positive for cosine, so this, again, could be no. Is definitely no. Alright, so since cosine is negative in quadrant 2 and quadrant 3, G and I are definitely not going to be equal to the cosine of 125. My reference angle is 55 degrees. Okay, here's my reference angle. Remember, when I sketch that, my reference angle is always drawn to the x-axis. So my reference angle is 55 degrees. So everything else that I look at should have the same reference angle as 55 degrees. So let's take a look at my reference angles for all of these. Okay, cosine of 145, that's in the second quadrant, so I'm going to take 180 and I'm going to subtract 145, and that gives me 35 degrees. Okay, so in this case, I know that since it's not the same reference angle, cosine of 55 is definitely not the same as cosine of 35, so that one could not be equal. For letter F, sine of 235 is in the third quadrant, so I'm going to take 235 and subtract 180. And I'm going to get 55. Now, could the sine of 55 and the cosine of 55 be equal? The answer is no. The reason is the only place where sine and cosine could possibly be equal is at 45 degrees. 45 degrees in the first quadrant, they're equal, and at the reference angle of 45 degrees in the third quadrant, they're also equal. Other than those two angles, sine and cosine will not be equal. So F could not be possible. We already ruled out B and G, so let's go on to the cosine of 215. 215 is in the third quadrant, which is negative. However, when I look at my reference angle, if I take 215 and I subtract my 180 to find the reference angle, I get 35 degrees. And again, we already talked about how the cosine of 35 is not equal to the cosine of 55. So this is no. 1 over the secant of 125 is basically like saying cosine of 125. So that is definitely a yes. Alright, so now that kind of narrows our choices right now. I want to come back to D in just a second, but I do want to go ahead and talk about E and J. So let's look at the reference angles for E and J. Cosine of 325, that is in the third quadrant, which means it's negative. And if I take 235 and I subtract 180 to find the reference angle, I get 55 degrees. So since it has the same reference angle, here's my third quadrant, those two triangles are definitely going to be the same, and I'm going to get the same cosine value for cosine of 235 as I do for cosine of 125. Sine of 325 kind of relates to letter D, so let's go ahead and talk about those two right now. Remember, if reference angles are complementary, then the cosine of the angle is going to be the same as the sine of the complement. Okay, so really this should be the sine of whatever theta is, 90 minus whatever theta is. Okay, or vice versa. Okay, so if I take the sine of theta, and I take cosine of 90 minus theta, again, angle complements. So for example, in this case, sine of 215, if I find the reference angle, I get 35 degrees. Now, are 35 and 55 complementary angles? Well, 55 plus 35 is equal to 90. So therefore, yes, they are complements. Complements are angles that add up to 90 degrees. Now, one is cosine, so the cosine of 55 is the same as the cosine, or the sine of 35. So, since 55 and 35 are complements, I know that cosine of 55 is the same as the sine of 35, which is the complement of 55. So you have to ask yourself, in this case, sine of 215 is negative. So negative sine of 35 will be the same as the cosine of 125. So yes, those are the same. And then for the same reason, in the fourth quadrant, sine is negative. And if I find the reference angle here, 360 minus 325, I am left with, again, 35 degrees. So the sine of 35 is the same as the cosine of 55. So yes, this is also equal.